wrote a new constitution. And here's what they did. I'm just going to cut through the details, but for us, now we're all economists now. What they're going to do is they're going to create a new kind of democracy. There's zillions of kinds of democracies because they have different rules about who decides what when. So what the U.S. Constitution did is it set a new set of rules. So what it did is it completely took the ability to levy the one tax that raised revenues, the tariff, away from the 13 states, and it gave it to the central government. It took fiscal sovereignty away from the 13 states and gave it to the federal government. That's in our Constitution. It took the ability to regulate trade away from the 13 states, and it's totally under the federal government. That's a huge redesign. And then the next thing it did was it answered, so the next thing it did is it did a complete federal bailout of all the 13 states' debts, a complete assumption of the debts. All those debts become the obligations of the central government. That's how we began. The United States began with a tremendous bailout of everybody. And the reason that we did this is the Founding Fathers were going to answer our two key questions. Should a government pay its debts? Yes. Should a central government bail out subordinate states? Yes, they said. Now the question is why? Why did they do that? Well, fortunately, they told us why. It's because Alexander Hamilton was our first Secretary of Treasury, a brilliant man. He's 33 years old, who read fewer economics books than you've read. He read them when he was a soldier. And George Washington, our president, who didn't go to college. You have more education than George Washington. They strongly they strongly wanted to answer both of those questions, and they gave the reason. First reason was this, and this is the core of the thing. So the question is, am I talking about the United States history? Yes. Am I talking about Europe? Despite my denial. So the first question they answered, should a government pay its debts? They said, yes. Now you could say, well, wait a second. Why should you pay your debts? It's actually costly to pay your debts. You already got the money. You already fought the war. Why not just default, and you won't have to raise the taxes? Because it's going to be costly to raise taxes. Why should you ever pay your debts? And that was the argument that prevailed before. And Alexander Hamilton and George Washington gave the counter-argument. They said, that would be fine if we were sure we would never have to borrow again. But if we ever want to borrow again from foreigners and our own, we might want to have a reputation for paying our debts. Now, why would we ever want to borrow again? Well, if we were sure that the world were certain and there weren't unusual risks or opportunities that come along, we wouldn't want to borrow again. We just balance our expenditures and our taxes and no shocks. But they said the world is unusual. There are unusual events. There are wars, and maybe there are opportunities. Maybe one day, 10 years from now, this is far-fetched, France or Spain will offer to sell us Louisiana, and we can double the size of the United States if we have the money, or if we can borrow the money. So Hamilton makes this argument very concisely and very well, and George Washington, who probably didn't graduate from high school, understood it. So that was their argument. Now, question is, so that's their answer for yes, for the second one, for the first question. Now the second question is more subtle. Should a central government bail out subordinate governments? You understand what I mean? Should the central government bail out these 13 states? Don't think about Europe. So Hamilton is this 33-year-old kid, wrote this report on public credit, and he says why they should bail it out. He's just completely upfront. He says, what I want to do is I want to rearrange the political interests in the economy and in the politics so that there will be political constituencies for the government to use the tariff to raise enough revenues to service all the debts. So what I want to do is I want to make the creditors of the 13 states become interesting advocates of a high federal tax. And these creditors of the 13 states are powerful people. They're the moneyed interests. They're the commercial people that lent to the government, those 13 states. He wants to take their allegiance away from the state capitals and put them onto the central government. And he says he wants to do it. It's a grand bargain. And it's a brilliant analysis in what some people call political economy or politics. And he wants them and their representatives to vote for high taxes. He wants the high taxes. The U.S. government is going to impose high taxes on tariff. It's not a, what do you call it? Someone in trade. It's not a protectionist tariff. It's not a protection. It's a revenue-raising tariff. He doesn't want to keep goods out. He wants to tax them, get the revenues. And he wants to use the revenues to get the government surplus to pay off the debts. Why? So that he has a good reputation for borrowing. That's how it all fits together. So that's what they did. They set up these new institutions, and what are the outcomes? Okay, so the left-hand side is my new environment. Remember what I was very pedantic. For me, an environment, it's just boring. A list of agents, a list of their actions, information flows, timing protocols, who chooses what when. We kind of rearranged those. Now the people who are setting tariffs are all sitting in one common legislature. It's not 13. So what are the outcomes? The outcomes are sharp. First, this debt that was going at 10 or 20% on the dollar goes to par. In 1790, the United States government completely refinances its debt. And if you had bought this debt in 1786, you would have done really well. There was increased liquidity of the debt. There was large federal tax revenue. The government budget, they were able to raise so much revenue that they were spending half of their government revenue on just servicing the debt. And then finally, they did all this, and then finally, so they set up this fiscal union. And the reason they set up this fiscal union wasn't to create a monetary union. They already had a monetary union, because all this debt is denominated in dollars. They did this first, and then if you want, here's a little curiosity. They were paying off in dollars. Those were still Spanish dollars. And then after they refinanced the debt, they actually said, wait a minute, these dollars have the King of Spain on them. As good Americans, we can't have that. So what they did is they said, we'll have the American dollar. So they said the Congress invented American dollar after this. And what is an American dollar? It's a copy of the Spanish dollar. It has exactly the same amount of silver, but instead of the King of Spain, it has an eagle on it. And it says, God bless America. But to an economist, who cares whether it's the King or Spain or says, God bless America? I just care it has the same amount of silver. So that's the story, how our institutions were created. But, and I was talking with one of your faculty members today about constitutions and what's covered in a constitution and what's not. Things are always left ambiguous. So just I'm going to conclude with a sequel to this. So that's how we created a strong federal government. Okay. So, reputation. Okay, so now here's the key thing that was relevant then and it's relevant now. So what the U.S. government did by these arrangements, it created a strong reputation for paying its debts vis-a-vis the creditors of the U.S. government. But it also did, the central government created a reputation vis-a-vis the states that it would bail them out. In the future, maybe. You bailed me out once, maybe you'll do it again. So now the question is, would they? So I'm going to fast forward, tell you a little U.S. history. So would they? So the first reputation with creditors is what they wanted to do. The second thing, creating this reputation with the states that you're going to bail them out, that's what we call moral hazard. And they didn't want to do that, but they did it inadvertently. So now I'm going to fast forward. Interesting stories about U.S. history. People thought while the federal government was able to raise revenues, it could not spend those revenues on infrastructure projects that went across state lines, that were within one state. I'll just tell you that. So in the 1820s and 30s, there's a so-called transportation revolution. Canals and railroad technology develops, and Americans wanted to build them. But we're a very poor country. Private enterprise couldn't do it. Capital markets weren't developed. So various people said the state should do it. Well, the federal government couldn't do it for constitutional reasons. So what happened was the states started issuing debt, which they used to help railroads and canals build infrastructure projects. And now I'll tell you a little story. This is a fact. Got it partly from Milton Friedman, got it partly from my own research with my friends. Fiscal crises often produce political revolutions. And what I mean by a political revolution is could be violent, could be peaceful, but it's a rewriting of the Constitution. Who decides what when? So the fiscal crisis in the 1780s created a political revolution in America. The fiscal crisis that occurred in France in 1789 also created a political revolution that you know. But here's another one. I don't know if you know it, but in the United States today, state governments have a requirement that they have to balance their budget every year. And that's in their constitutions. Okay? So every state government, unlike Europe, every state government has to balance its budget. In the beginning, that was not true. They could run government deficits. And I'm going to tell you what the origin of those restrictions were. And the origin is the dictum, fiscal crises often produce political revolutions. So here's what happened. 1820s and 1830s, states issue lots of debt. They use it to finance railroads and canals. Lots of interesting details. They say these debts are going to pay for themselves because when the railroads and canals start working, we're going to get all these revenues, and our tax revenues are going to go up, and the bonds will pay off for themselves. Don't worry about it. Well, guess what? There's a financial crisis emanating from England. A bunch of these state bonds go into default. Now, it's interesting. Who owned these bonds? A big majority of them were owned by British people. And why not? Because the U.S. had a good reputation with its creditors, and we had bailed out states before. So what happened was the creditors and the various state governments, they go to Congress, and they ask Congress, bail us out. And there's a big debate. And here's what happens. Big debate, Congress says no. Congress says no, and these state governments either repudiate their debt or take a long time to pay. And there's a generation where not only state credit, by then the federal government had no debt. The debt then, it's a lot like Europe now. The debt then is entirely state debt, and the federal government refuses to pay it. So why did it give a different answer, and what were the consequences? So now the United States is reversing its answer to that second question. And so here's the answer that I think. They went down and asked what the consequences if they did pay it. So if they bailed them out once, again, do you think that would have been the last time they were going to bail them out? Or do you think it would be a green light to the state governments being profligate? Which is a moral hazard problem, and the Congress said no, even at big cost, because federal credit, the British punished us for over a generation by not buying, not only did they buy state debts, they wouldn't buy federal debt. And there's interesting side stories here. So you all know about our Bill of Rights. Our Bill of Rights has 10 amendments, but there's an 11th amendment to the Constitution, and the British didn't read it. And what the 11th amendment does is it denies foreigners or residents of other states of any investor protection against a state government. Read it. That's the 11th amendment of the Constitution. That's what it does. It was passed in 1792, right from the beginning. So the U.S. Constitution says state governments must pay their debt. The 11th Amendment says you can't enforce it. So anyway, people learn that. They know that now. So what was the consequence of that? This had big consequences. Every state government, more than half the state governments, after the federal government refused to bail them out, they rewrote their constitutions. And it's that point they put in balanced budget requirements. Federal government didn't tell them to do it. Federal government said, we don't care what you're going to do. We're not going to bail you out anymore. And people said, don't you remember Alexander Hamilton, what he did? He bailed us out. That was then, this is now. So are there lessons about this?